The first thing he saw was smoke. Not the wild kind, just a soft thread of it rising from the edge of the cottonwoods near the creek where no chimney should have been. Harlan Creed had been up since before the sun-patching fence posts with stiff hands and a back too old for what winter had done. He wasn't looking for company, wasn't expecting anything but frost and quiet. But that smoke, it carried something strange in it. He followed it, slowly. No rifle, just his coat patched twice at the elbows and a thermos of cold coffee he hadn't touched since dawn. What he found was not a fire. It was a cabin, or what used to be one walls, half-fallen roof caved in on the right door barely hanging. And from inside, a sound. Thin, broken, not a cry exactly. More like the whimper of someone trying not to cry anymore. He stepped to the threshold and paused, because he knew she was alone, and she was giving birth. A girl no older than 20, soaked with sweat and fear, torn between breathing and screaming. Blankets piled under her, none clean. No basin, no fire, no hand to hold, and no one coming. He took off his coat, dropped it at the door, then he took off his shirt. She couldn't speak, not right then, but she saw him, his eyes steady, his hands trembling but sure. He didn't say, "It's okay." It wasn't, but he knelt beside her anyway, silent, present, shirt pressed against her back, catching what the world had left behind. What happened next when the world found out what he did? And why, after all those years alone, did this rancher finally leave his front gate open? The snow had started falling sometime before dusklight, at first, then heavier, clinging to fence rails and brushwood like it meant to stay. The wind howled, but the land itself made no protest, as if it had long accepted the cold and the silence that followed it. Harlan Creed, a rancher who spoke more to his horses than to folks, had been fixing a loose plank on the back fence when he first noticed the smoke. It wasn't the good kind, not from a cook stove or chimney, but faint, thin curling from the woods east of the hollow. An odd place for any cabin to still be standing. He didn't go to it right away. Men like Harlan had learned to leave strange things alone, especially if they weren't calling out for help. But that night when he sat by the fire with a dry biscuit and old stew, something gnawed at him. Not hunger, something else. In that same hour, Leon, the woman in the broken cabin, pressed her back against the splintered wall and tried not to scream. Her breath was shallow. The pain came like waves tightening around her ribs. Her hands were raw from breaking brush for kindling, but the fire had died hours ago. Her dress, once pale yellow, was damp and torn. She had managed to boil a rag and keep some water in a dented tin bowl. But it wasn't enough. Not for what was coming. She had not meant to give birth here. She had not meant to do it alone. But the ones who brought her west, those who promised something like marriage and something like family, had taken her coin, her voice, and her dignity. And when her belly began to show, they left her here. Left her to labor among rats and win among forgotten names and half-built promises. The wind screamed louder now, like it knew what was happening, like it disapproved. Back at the ranch, Harlan finally stood. He didn't know what he was doing, only that something had settled uneasy in his chest. He grabbed a blanket, his lantern, and a coat too thin for winter. Then he saddled the mule instead of the horse. A mule walked steadier when you didn't know what waited ahead. When he reached the woods, the smoke was gone, but he found tracks in the snow, bare feet, stumbling, turning back then forward again, and beside them small dots of blood. He followed them without thought, like a man walking through a dream. And when he reached the cabin door, half-hanging, roof bowed inward, he heard the sound that would split something in him clean through. Not a scream, a sob, a woman's. And something else beneath it, the first cry of a child being born into this unforgiving world. He didn't knock. He just stepped in. She looked up, her hands still cradling a newborn, her arms slick with sweat and blood and ash. Her lips trembled not with fear, but disbelief. He took off his coat, then his shirt, and without a word knelt beside her and wrapped the baby in what warmth he had left. It wasn't mercy, it wasn't heroism. It was something quieter than that, something more human. As dawn began to light the frost outside, a single wail rose in the cabin. And Harlan Creed, the man who'd lived alone for 7 years, whispered the first words he'd spoken aloud in days. "You're not alone now." Leon didn't speak that first morning. Her voice had been lost somewhere between the first contraction and the moment the rancher entered. not just lost to pain, but to disbelief. For too long, every outstretched hand had turned to ash. But Harlan Creed wasn't a man of many hands or many words. He just moved around the room quiet-like. He gathered more wood than she could have imagined a man his age would carry. He warmed water, tore the cleanest edges from a feed sack to fashion swaddles, and set a pot of beans on the fire as if it were any ordinary morning. When Leon finally found the strength to sit up, she noticed the smell first. Clean wool, burned sugar, earth. The baby dark-haired, stubborn lunged, already kicking, was wrapped in his shirt. He'd given the only thing warm he had and hadn't asked for anything back. She tried to speak, to thank him, but her throat rasped instead. He poured water into a tin cup and held it out, eyes steady. "Slow," he said. "No need to rush." Outside, the snow had softened to sleet, and the path to the cabin was already half erased. But Harlan didn't look back. He had set his coat across the broken window, patched the roof with his own tarp, and placed a small jar of molasses on the shelf beside the baby's head. He hadn't meant to stay, but the fire he built that night, it didn't flicker out. Over the next day and night, they settled into something like silence, but not the hollow kind. It was full of meaning, like the hush before prayer. Leon fed her baby, now named Rue, after the only sound he made when soothed. She watched the way Harlan moved about the room, repairing things, not because he wanted thanks, but because they needed doing. And Harlan, for the first time in years, found his hands wanted to fix more than fences. He watched how she held her child, even with bruises on her arms. He noticed how she wrapped her pain in quietness, like a person taught not to ask for anything. He didn't ask where she came from, didn't ask who had hurt her, but when she turned away to cry, thinking he couldn't hear, he quietly tossed more wood into the fire. Not to warm the room, just so she wouldn't be cold while remembering. By dusk, when Rue finally slept, Leon looked up and asked the first full question she'd spoken in days. "Why'd you stop?" He didn't understand, so she clarified. "Why'd you stop at my door?" He didn't answer right away, just reached for his hat and placed it by the fire, then sat across from her. "Because no one ever stopped for Anna," he said. Then he looked down at his hands as if surprised they still worked after all these years. The snow didn't return, but the cold did. It crept into the corners of the cabin and settled in the floorboards like an old regret that refused to thaw. Harlan worked with a quiet urgency those next few days. He patched leaks in the roof with oiled canvas and pulled nails from salvaged wood. The trail back to his own ranch was still walkable, but he hadn't taken it. Not once. Leon watched from the doorway, her baby wrapped tight against her chest, warm in that old shirt. She didn't ask him to stay. She didn't ask him to go either. There was a rhythm building in the house, a rhythm that made no promises but made things possible. Until the knock came. Late afternoon, sharp, measured. Harlan opened the door to find two men in boots too polished for mountain roads. The taller one had a star pinned to his coat. The other held a folded paper and a look that had practiced indifference. "We heard there's a woman squatting here," the tall one said. "Name's Leon Chow. Been reported missing. By her kin." Harlan looked back at the hearth at the flicker of orange light resting on the baby's face. He turned back to the lawman, his jaw tense, but he didn't lie. "She's here," he said. "But she ain't squatting. She's healing." The other man snorted, "With a bastard in tow." Before he finished the word, Harlan had stepped off the porch. Not rushed, just close enough. "I wouldn't say that again," he said. "Not if you plan on staying upright." The men left without another word, but they left the paper behind. A custody claim, stamped, signed by someone named Charles Fang, Leon's father-in-law. Inside, she stood still, clutching Rue, her breath shallow. "He's not coming back for me," she said quietly. "He's coming for Rue." Harlan didn't ask why. Didn't ask what had happened in the old house with the red doors and silk curtains. He only watched her face as it folded into silence, then stepped to the hearth and stoked the fire higher. That night she told him. About David, her husband. Gone 3 winters ago, drowned in a frozen creek while hauling lumber for a house that was never finished. About the Fang family, how they had kept her not as kin, but as property to barter. And how when the belly began to swell, they stopped calling her widow and started calling her trouble. "I ran before they could sell me to some broker out east," she whispered. "But they don't want me back. Just the child." Harlan didn't speak right away. He just took a piece of tin from the wall, hammered it into the window's crack, and finally said, "They'll have to get through me." The sun came slow through the trees, cutting the cold with long golden fingers. Leon had moved a chair closer to the window where the light fell. She held Rue in her lap, not to feed, not to hush, just to hold. The child cooed softly, content in the stillness. For the first time in weeks, Harlan returned to his own land. Just long enough to check the horses and gather a few tools. When he came back, she was standing outside, sleeves-rolled boots wet with melting snow. A shallow trench of water followed the cabin's edge, tracing the slow thaw. "You fixed the west wall," he said. She nodded. The wind was creeping in. They didn't say much after that, but something between them had shifted, subtle, like the way winter surrenders to spring without asking permission. That evening as they ate, Leon slid a worn envelope across the table. "My husband wrote this before he left that day," she said. "I never opened it." Harlan glanced at it, then her. "You sure now's the time?" She shook her head. "No, but I think you should keep it." He didn't argue, just folded it carefully and placed it inside a tin box on the mantel. They watched the fire, the only sound that of Rue's steady breathing and the soft tick of a spoon against ceramic. Later that night, he found her outside. She wasn't crying, just watching the stars. One hand wrapped around the railing, the other pressed gently to her belly, not out of pain but memory. "I used to believe I needed a place that was mine," she said, eyes still upward. "Now I think maybe I just needed a place that wasn't trying to erase me." Harlan didn't say he understood. He didn't need to. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a length of faded red cloth, the same torn scrap he'd used once to tie his horse's reins. "You might need this if you're staying." She took it, not as a gift, as recognition. That night the wind came down from the north, sharp and clean, clearing the last of the ash from the sky. The house creaked once, then settled. Inside, Rue slept soundly between two blankets, and Leon for the first time slept without boots on her feet. The thaw brought more than green buds. It brought hoof prints where there shouldn't be any, and smoke on the far side of the ridge. Harlan didn't ask questions, not right away. But his hands started moving differently. He'd stop at the fence line longer. He'd sharpen the axe too often. Leon felt it. She didn't say anything either. Some days she walked the length of the field with Rue wrapped against her chest. She hummed an old tune she couldn't remember learning, something her mother used to sing over stew. Other days she sat near the creek bed and stared at nothing until the cold crept up her sleeves. One night Harlan came back later than usual. His shirt was torn, his cheek carried a scratch. She didn't speak, just poured him hot water for his hands. "They know you're here," he said finally. "His people." She nodded, eyes down. "They think I've taken something that ain't mine." Her voice was quiet. "Did you?" He didn't answer at first. "Then no. But maybe I'm afraid to admit I want to." The air was still between them. The only sound came from the fire, cracking low in the hearth like a secret being whispered. "I stayed too long once," she said. "Let people decide who I was, what I owed." Harlan looked at her then. "And now I don't know yet." They didn't touch, but their shadows on the wall leaned toward each other as if gravity had decided before either of them could. Later, as the snow fully retreated and the cabin felt more like a place someone chose, not a place someone fled, a man came down the trail. He wore a black coat and rode a fine horse. His words were smooth, his boots polished, his eyes sharp. "I'm looking for a woman. Name's Leon Joe." Harlan didn't flinch. "Ain't seen her." The man smiled. "I think you have." He left a card. That night, Leon found Harlan sitting on the porch, the firelight catching the lines on his face. "You'd still keep me here?" she asked. "Even if they come?" He nodded. "I didn't keep you. You stayed." The name on the card was Mr. Carl Denning. 3 days after he visited the ranch, folks in town started whispering. The saloon keeper asked where Harlan was keeping that foreign girl. A woman at the general store passed a note to Leon, folded into the change. It said, "They don't want you here." No signature. But back at the cabin, morning still came gentle. Leon hung the linens in the sun and let Rue nap in a crate filled with wildflowers. She swept the floor, patched a loose window, stirred broth from nothing but root ends and bone. She did not hide, and she did not run. Harlan watched her from the porch. There was something in the way she moved slow, sturdy, that made him believe she had always belonged here. The land didn't mind her silence. The wind seemed to bend to her humming, and still she hadn't told him the whole of her past. One night she did. She laid Rue down, folded her hands, and said he was not the father, but he bought the right to act like one. She told him how she had been promised to someone else, someone kind. Then war came, and that man never returned. Instead, Denning arrived a man with power, but no grace. He took her hand with paper, not love. He took her body with expectation, not tenderness. She escaped when the doctor said the child would come early. I didn't want Rue born into his name. Harlan didn't speak for a long time. Then he said, she won't be. There was no grand kiss, no proposal. Only the sound of a door closing gently behind them as they stepped out together under a sky that finally looked soft again. Snow came late that year. It arrived quiet like an apology. Harlan had finished patching the roof just in time. He didn't complain, though his fingers ached from the hammer. He worked like a man who'd spent most of his life alone and now couldn't bear to be unprepared. Inside the cabin, Leon sat near the stove with Rue tucked against her shoulder. The baby had grown strong, wide-eyed, curious. When Rue smiled in her sleep, Leon would smile too absent-mindedly, as if muscle remembered joy before the mind did. They no longer locked the door. Neighbors had stopped by. Not many, but enough. A jar of honey, a sack of apples. Miss Tilda from the post office brought a quilt she said she'd sewn years ago and never had anyone to give it to. The town hadn't exactly embraced them, but it hadn't turned them out either. That was enough. One morning as Harlan pulled on his boots, Leon looked at him and said, "We could name her." He blinked, surprised. "You haven't. I wanted to wait." "Until the world felt safe." He nodded. "You got one in mind." She looked toward the window. "Ruth means friend." He smiled, soft and quiet. "Then that's who she is." Later that day, Harlan carved her name into the beam over the hearth. Just once. Small, but it was there. In this house that had once held nothing but wind and silence, now something stayed. A name. A child. A woman who had learned to breathe again. And a man who had learned to open the door. The fire's gone out, but the coals still glow. Do you want to see what warms next? Some things in this life don't come with noise or fanfare. They arrive quietly like a newborn's breath in the dark, or a rancher's coat laid down in silence. Harlan Creed hadn't planned on becoming anything more than a man who fixed fences and kept to himself. And yet by offering a single gesture, his own shirt, his quiet company, he changed 2 lives, and maybe even saved them. Leon, once forgotten in the woods, found something more than shelter in that broken cabin. She found what many of us hope for late in life, a place to rest without shame. A home not built from grand declarations, but from small kindnesses repeated each day, wood chopped before first light bread, shared without being asked, and presents kept when the storms rolled in. And maybe that's the truth we often miss. That healing doesn't always look like miracles. Sometimes it's just staying, listening, letting someone breathe easier because you didn't walk away. If this story touched you, if it reminded you of someone who stayed when they didn't have to share it, let someone else remember the power of quiet love. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, stories of second chances and simple redemption, please subscribe to None, Wild West Saga, and let us know in the comments, do you want to see what happens next? Would you stay if someone needed you that way? We're here, and we're listening.